creating chaos and confusion is part of the plan. So, and you can only spend so much energy and time trying to guess what could happen and, plan for different scenarios, because there's always plenty of work to do.
Former President Donald Trump made immigration a focal point of his campaign, and he promised mass deportations of undocumented people. His re-election has raised questions about how a mass deportation plan might be carried out. And it's also created fear and confusion in immigrant communities. Tessa Lemos Del Pino is executive director of Tennessee Justice for Our Neighbors, a nonprofit working to help people navigate the immigration system. And as you might imagine, her office has been overwhelmed with calls and concern. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. It's Banner and Company. I'm wondering what the answering machine sounds like, or your emails and text messages. I mean, what sorts of questions are you getting, and are you shocked by any of them?
So there are folks who are like wondering, what does this mean for my case? And so there's a lot of, one-on-one, conversations with the clients themselves. There are others who are, all of a sudden they're terrified and they're not currently a client and they're like, oh my gosh, I need to talk to somebody. There are others who are calling and saying, what happens? Is there someplace safe that I can go in the event? So we're connecting with all of the organizations, trying to figure out what all of the resources that will be available to folks. We have our list of standard resources, in terms of shelters and that type of thing. But there's going to need to be more resources available to people.
And do you foresee people leaving the state of Tennessee for places they think might be better protection?
Not really.
Because it's going to be the same everywhere?
Yeah. I mean, they would have to go pretty far away.
So how are people led to believe that there can be a mass deportation that happens quickly?
That would be absolute chaos. I don't really know how one can carry that out with violating the due process rights of some individuals. Right now, the way the system works is deportation is really focused on people who've committed serious crimes. In this case, if you were to have mass deportations, you're looking at anyone and everyone, and you're looking at millions of children whose parents may be undocumented, but they're U.S. citizen children, who would then be looking at how to navigate the world without their family. There are, millions of individuals who live with a family member who's undocumented, and you're looking at ripping families apart. You're putting at risk individuals who are U.S. citizens or who do have a green card and possibly getting brought into that system, because we do know that when there were deportations happening under the Trump administration in the past, there were U.S. citizens who were brought into the fold who should not have been part of that process. So it will create a lot of chaos and a lot of fear and a lot of untrust amongst each other.
Tell me about Tennessee Justice for Our Neighbors. What is it that this group does?
So Tennessee Justice for Our Neighbors is essentially a not-for-profit law office, and we provide legal representation for individuals seeking humanitarian relief in the immigration system. But we also educate the community about immigration, and we advocate for immigrants. It's all part of what's called the national network called Immigration Law and Justice Network, founded after UMCOR, which is the United Methodist Committee on Relief, realized that there was a need for legal services for immigrants seeking humanitarian relief. And so they started working out of churches, working with volunteers, setting up legal clinics. Started as a pilot project and then eventually has grown over the years. And so now there are 19 sites throughout the country serving thousands of immigrants every year.
Did you see this storm brewing?
Yes and no. Part of me, I think, because of my personal bubble, was really, really hopeful that folks would not necessarily vote in a way that would harm the immigrant community. I wanted to hold on to that hope, but either way, we knew that there were going to be changes happening in the immigration system. It was sort of, it was the hottest topic on both sides. And unfortunately, because of power structures, immigrants became a really easy target for a lot of different politicians.
What's on the horizon? What's coming up?
So a bill was introduced yesterday. It was HB in the House Bill 0011, and that is around driver's licenses. Essentially, it would make U.S. citizen and non-citizen driver's license physically look different. I think it's a matter of coloring, how the licenses are colored. It doesn't change the structure of who's entitled to a license. And the truth is, if you qualify for a license, if you're able to get one, it really shouldn't. There shouldn't be a difference in color. It's just sort of a flag for people who are stopping individuals. And it can cause a lot of confusion because the immigration system is really, really complicated. And as it is, our officers are already burdened with trying to, deal with a whole lot of other things, but trying to understand the whole immigration system and become an immigration officer is just adding more to their plate. The other bill that has been out, that's getting a lot of discussion right now, is the voucher bill. And that is part of the immigrant communities. It's on our radar because it excludes non-citizens from receiving the scholarships for the school vouchers.
And of course, there's another bill that our state politics reporter Sarah Grace Taylor wrote about this week. That one would require law enforcement to transport undocumented immigrants to so-called sanctuary cities. To help listeners understand, can you give a little context there?
So there's three main ways to navigate the immigration system. There's your family-based way, and so that's if you are married to someone or you're the parent or child of a U.S. citizen. There's employer-based, so that's where you have your researchers, your doctors, your special professors.
These people with extraordinary talents or so forth.
Correct. And then there's a humanitarian area, and that's where we do our work. So those are your asylum seekers, those are your survivors of crimes, serious crimes that have taken place in the United States, and folks have cooperated with the prosecution to make our whole community safer. We also represent folks who are survivors of domestic violence, people who qualify for relief under the Violence Against Women Act. We represent people who have been trafficked, both labor and sex trafficking. We represent children who've been abused, abandoned, or neglected by a parent and are entitled to something called special immigrant juvenile status. But we also represent a lot of DACA recipients and folks who have temporary protected status.
Of course, DACA is Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals.
So those are people who were brought to the United States as a child. And there are a lot of different rules. You have to have arrived before a certain date. You had to have been a certain age before a certain date in order to qualify for these things. And then you apply to renew every 2 years. And with that, you're able to work, get your work authorization, and get your driver's license.
Yeah. And I would think that mere days or weeks could mean the difference between...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, you hear stories all the time of individuals who, their older brothers and sisters applied and they received DACA, but they were too young to apply at the time. They wait, and then by the time it's their age qualifies, it's no longer an option.
If you can, without, violating their privacy, tell us some stories about your clients that are currently very nervous.
Sure. So our DACA clients are probably the most nervous right now because we don't know what will happen to DACA. We recently had the opportunity to invite a couple of our clients to share their story at our annual fundraiser. One of them was an individual who has worked in the construction industry. He was a project manager for a large organization, and they basically build churches and healthcare facilities. Another individual who'd studied at UT and was working to become an architect. And they have worked their whole lives. I mean, over and over you hear about people who studied engineering, but they can't have a license to practice engineering, and they're DACA recipients. And then all of a sudden, everything can be ripped away from them. The two individuals who I'm referring to who shared their stories with our audience that night, both of them came as toddlers, and so they were very small children. They have never been back to the countries where they were born, and so they don't know what they would be looking at. One of them has since married. The other is has a long-term committed relationship, and they would be leaving everything that they have built.
Okay, let's listen to Carlos, one of the speakers at that fundraiser. He's talking about his experience with DACA and what it's meant to him.
Yeah, so I was born in Mexico, and just like a lot of people that have DACA, we came to, our parents brought us here for just the opportunities that my mom didn't have at the time. So my mom brought us me when I was around 2 years old. I started hearing about DACA when I believe I was like a sophomore in high school. I started hearing like my friends having it, being able to get a driver's license, being able to start working. And I'm talking to my mom and I'm saying, hey, I think this is good. I think I need this. But man, she was scared. We're living here undocumented, and to give the government your personal information, your address, all of your information, that's a lot of risk.
It's Banner and Company. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. We'll be right back. Lots of people with very specific cases, because I would assume everyone's circumstance is different.
Absolutely. And that's why it's really important for people to talk to an attorney. A lot of times well-meaning individuals might say, oh, I know so-and-so, or a family member or a church member has this circumstance, and they don't have all of the facts of the case. And they might say, well, surely they qualify for some relief. But the truth is there are a lot of people who've been in our country for a very long time and do not have a form of relief available to them. And even if they do, the wait is really long. I mentioned U visas, and those are people who are victims of really serious crimes that have taken place here. There's multiple steps in it. They have to get what's called a U certification from the police department. They have to cooperate with the prosecution. And even in those instances, now you're looking at 15 years for that whole process to be completed.
How do these people in daily life, do they constantly worry that some card is going to flip that's going to reveal their vulnerability in terms of their citizenship?
Immigrants are not a monolith, and so it's hard to say one way or another on that. What we do find a lot of the times, we have some very resilient clients who are just, have their nose to the grindstone, and they're just pushing through. The circumstances that led them to be here were pretty dire, so they've faced some really tough decisions. They faced some really tough circumstances. And they just keep pushing through.
Yeah. And as we said before, when you and I were talking before we started the interview, these are folks that live among us, are our neighbors, who we trust in some cases with our kids or our family members. And there seems to be a different attitude once we talk about their legal status versus their human status.
Right, right. Yeah. And that's what's the most disheartening, when folks, throw around terms that just dehumanize individuals. I look at my grandfather, and he was undocumented for many, many years. And I don't really know when or how he went through the process, but either way, he was a kind man who picked fruit that, maybe you've got a 30-year-old bottle of wine. Maybe he picked the grapes that were part of that wine bottle. I don't know. Maybe he was the one who he eventually worked as a custodian in a public school. Maybe he was the one who cleaned up after your child. I don't know. But these are the folks who, are part of our community on a daily basis. They make up almost 75% of the food crops industry, the food workers. They make up 18% of healthcare. They make up, a quarter of construction. People, what would it look like if we didn't have folks building our buildings? What would it look like if we didn't have enough nurses or doctors to suddenly have those vacancies?
Talk a little bit about the Afghan families.
Sure.
We all were watching the news when so many of the people from Afghanistan did come into the country, and I think a lot of people just, okay, they're here, and then they tuned out. What happens now for those individuals?
Yeah, so the Afghan evacuations are really complicated. So a lot of folks, I want to say it was like 80% of the individuals who were evacuated to the States had what was called humanitarian parole status. And initially, when they were brought here, there were no plans to help them figure out how to navigate the immigration system. Those folks needed to apply for asylum. And so several of us, of groups who were working with the immigrant community, partnered together. Those folks in Nashville, there were 492 of them, were referred to our office. At the time, our caseload was about 500, so we essentially doubled our caseload. Yeah. And an asylum case is not an easy short-term case. You have to apply. Typically speaking, you have to apply for asylum within 1 year of arrival or 1 year of entry. There's a lot of different things. That's not a blanket rule, but there are a lot of different rules that come into place. With the Afghans, eventually they pushed that out, and they gave folks 2 years. And we had a client who just got approval in the last week, and he was the very first case that we filed. When all the cases were referred to us. Now, we had people who we filed for them afterwards and were approved beforehand, but it just kind of goes to show you, the timeline is not straightforward with individuals. But they all left behind people. And so there had been hopes for them that they would be able to bring those remaining family members. And they have, a lot of the folks have settled down. They have, they have their work, that type of thing. Their kids are enrolled in schools. But they're also still worried about their family members who are left behind. Without going into details, I do recall one of the Afghans who I know who had left behind family and was really, really worried at one point because his 14-year-old brother had been held at gunpoint by the Taliban, and it was a sibling he'd left behind. There's folks who left behind grandma, and it wasn't a matter of it was a flip of a switch in the way that they left. There were stories of folks who literally left their tea just shaking in their cup and as they left. There were stories of folks who came with families of 3 or 4 individuals, and all of their belongings were in one backpack. And so they've worked really hard to rebuild their lives, but it was a traumatic event for them. And there was a lot of work going into representing them.
Again, every case is different, but the folks that you have that are on DACA status and they already are in I guess you have to renew that from time to time. Do they now say, I'm too scared to admit this and stop the process? Do they continue it? I mean, is there blanket advice, or is every case different?
I think that folks should definitely speak to an attorney, like, about their specific case, because each immigration form of relief has a specific law that it's applying to. For DACA folks, they're already in the system. Folks already know who they are. So we encourage our clients to go ahead and renew. We're also encouraging our clients, if they have filed paperwork, to make sure that they're keeping that on them, so that in the event that they get stopped, there's something to prove that they have, because the officers cannot, they're not immigration officers, but at least they have something with them that they can show. I'm in the system. People know I'm here, and it's okay for me to be here right now.
So literally have those papers in your car or in a wallet or some way to show those.
Yeah.
Which
is a huge luxury, because, do you carry your birth certificate around with you? I don't.
I know. I was asked once for my original Social Security card, and I thought, I've never seen it.
Yeah.
It existed when I was 15 or whatever, but, point taken.
Yeah.
And we've also had some assurances that, at least in Davidson County, some elected officials have said that they prefer not to be aggressive and go after this sort of duty, because there's, frankly, enough police work to go around already. Do you trust that, or do you see that promise sort of fading away as this becomes a national push?
I trust the intent. I think that the Nashville leaders don't want to get into that. What worries me, though, is where state bills or the legislature might direct things further. And then the cost that's involved with litigating that, in the time, in the stress, in the confusion to the community. So I can't predict the future. I can't predict, what will happen. But I believe that there are good intentions behind our Nashville leaders.
It's Banner & Company. My guest is Tessa Lemos Del Pino, Executive Director of Tennessee Justice for Our Neighbors. We'll be right back. Why do you this is such a difficult question, I realize, but why do you think people seem to have such an appetite for a punitive plan like mass deportation? Are they misinformed about opportunities or benefits that somehow they're being denied?
I think they are misinformed. I think that there's disinformation, and I think they don't understand what the process is really like. I don't think folks understand that there are limited options, that they are lengthy options, that they are expensive options. And there's just so much misinformation out there about what's happening. There's misinformation about criminality. And the fact is, as immigration has increased, the crime rate has gone down. I wish that people spent more time getting to know their neighbors, having conversations with them, getting to know, and thinking back, oh, wait, how did my family get here? Because it was also a very different system. For those of us who have been here for generations, the process was very different. We have clients who were awarded their U visas now who started their work with us in 2014. But the clients who are filing their U visas now are looking at a 15-year process.
It may be a naive question, but why? Why so long? Is it not enough people to look at this? And are these individuals laying eyes on the case and the person and coming up with their own, criteria, or is it a strict sort of a checklist?
Well, in the case of U visas, the U.S. only issues 10,000 per year. And so then they just start a wait list. And so it's just a matter of working through that wait list.
So the more people who arrive, the longer the list, the longer the wait.
Right.
And it's 10 or 15 years is not uncommon in your work?
No. Not for U visas now. That's the new standard.
Tessa, tell me how you ended up in Nashville.
I came to Nashville because my husband had a clerkship with the Sixth Circuit, working with Judge Martha Craig Daughtry. And so we came here for what we thought was going to be 1 year, and that was 2004. 20 years later, we're still here.
That is the story of Nashville, isn't it? You come from an immigrant family with quite a story. Can you give me sort of the Cliff Notes version of your family's experience in America?
Sure. So some of my family was here in the border crossed them. Both of my parents are migrant farm workers, but then my dad's father came to the United States literally in a covered wagon as a toddler with his brother after his mother had died from a medical infection that she received. She'd been doing laundry in the river, got a cut, and then died. But she was raising my grandpa and his brother alone because their father had been murdered prior to that. So he came because he was staying with family, with his aunt, and was raised by her here in the States.
And your family were farm workers on the West Coast?
Up and down the West Coast, yeah. So both my parents were born in Texas, and they worked up and down the country for years until they ultimately settled in Washington.
Were they still doing that sort of work when you were a little girl?
Not so much. I mean, my cousins were still doing it. Some of my aunts and uncles were still doing it. So I definitely spent some time in the asparagus fields and the cherry fields, but it wasn't how we were necessarily depending on for to be fed.
But I can imagine that the stories were incredible.
It was definitely part of my DNA. Yeah, because my family had worked in the fields for so long. Both my grandfathers on my maternal and paternal side saw education as the way out. One of my mom's younger siblings was college age or was still in high school when affirmative action came into place, and so my grandfather saw that as the green light. And ever since then, my mom's siblings all went to college after that. So my mom had already graduated, or actually she had to drop out while she was in high school in order to help take care of the family and work. But she went back to school. So I was already born when my mom went to community college and then the 4-year college and then her master's degree. And so I literally typed my mom's master's thesis. I was in junior high at the time. So education was always part of what was happening in my world.
Coming from the family that you came from, and obviously, loving the people that went through this suffering, did that inspire you to go into this work?
Yes. So both of my grandfathers always taught me that my role was to be an advocate for Mexican-American migrant farm workers. And I didn't know how that was going to take shape. So initially I went to law school. I knew I didn't want to practice law. Like by January of that first year, I was like, this is not for me. But because of a lot of the discrimination that I faced in school, I knew I needed to finish it. I knew I needed to study and take the bar. And I gave myself permission to leave practice at the end of my first year if I still felt the same way. So I finished graduation. I passed the bar on the first time, and I practiced for a year, and I still felt that same way. And I didn't know how I was going to end up becoming an advocate. I thought, social science might be the way. I worked at university. I worked at Columbia University for a long time. And this sort of ended up being the way because I had experience in a lot of the areas that were needed in this role. my family, like my aunts who had gone to college, they were all machistas. My uncles were machistas, so that's a Mexican-American group of students who, back in the day, they were always advocating for social justice. I had uncles who worked with the UFW. Cesar Chavez stayed at my grandparents' house when he would come to Washington. And I've got pictures, like black and white pictures that were part of this. They're at Washington State University, and they were all uploaded, and you can see my grandpa, or my uncle with them. So it's pretty amazing. But it's in the blood.
Yeah, inescapable.
Yeah, it's our responsibility too.
Banner and Company is a production of the New Nashville Banner. Our producers are Steve Haruch and Andrea Tudhope. Original music by Verlin Thompson. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or go to NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company. Tessa, our fishbowl contains the final question in this interview, which is posed by someone who sat in that chair prior to you.
Okay.
I don't know who. It's whichever one you choose.
So I'm supposed to draw from the fishbowl?
Luck of the draw from the fishbowl.
Let's see. This one's nice and tightly closed. Let's see what it says. This is from Joe West, and he asked, what's the sweetest,
biggest dream you want to happen in your life?
That we would all recognize the humanity in each other and use our power for good.